Hello, everybody, and welcome to Story Time with Miss Peggy. I'm going to be reading The Magician's Nephew, Chapter 5 this time. Last chapter was pretty exciting. Let me just read the last few words to remind you of how it ended. "Well, it's all over anyway," said Diggory. And they both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. And Chapter 5 is called The Deplorable Word. The children were facing one another across the pillar where the bell had hung, still trembling, though it no longer gave out any note. Suddenly, they heard a soft sound from the end of the room, which was still undamaged. They turned quick as lightning to see what it was. One of the robed figures, the farthest one of all, the woman whom Diggory thought was so beautiful, was rising from its chair. When she stood up, they realized that she was even taller than they had thought. And you could see at once, not just from her crown and her robes, but from the flash of her eyes and the curve of her lips, that she was a great queen. She looked around the room and saw the damage and saw the children, but you could not guess from her face what she thought of either or whether she was surprised. She came forward with long, swift strides. "Who has awakened me? Who has broken the spell?" she asked. "I think it must have been me," said Diggory. "You?" said the queen, laying her hand on his shoulder. A white, beautiful hand, but Diggory could feel that it was as strong as steel pincers. "You? But you're only a child, a common child. Anyone can tell at a glance that you have no drop of royal or noble blood in your veins. How did such as you dare to enter this house?" "We've come from another world by magic," said Polly, who thought it was high time that the queen took some notice of her as well as Diggory. "Is this true?" said the queen, still looking at Diggory and not even giving Polly a chance. "Yes, it is," he said. The queen put her other hand under his chin and forced it up so that she could see his face better. Diggory tried to stare back, but he soon had to let his eyes drop. There was something about hers that overpowered him. After she had studied him for well over a minute, she let go of his chin and said, "You are no magician. There's no mark on it. You must be only the servant of a magician. It's on another's magic that you traveled here." "It was my Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. At that moment, not in the room itself, but from somewhere very close, there came first a rumbling, then a creaking, and then a roar of falling masonry, and the floor shook. "There is great peril here," said the queen. "The whole palace is breaking up. If we're not out of it in a few minutes, we shall be buried under the ruin." She spoke as calmly as if she had been merely mentioning the time of day. "Come," she added, and then held out a hand to each of the children. Polly, who was disliking the queen and feeling rather sulky, would not have held her hand if she could have helped it, but though the queen spoke so calmly, her movements were as quick as thought. Before Polly knew what was happening, her left hand had been caught in a hand so much larger and stronger than her own that she could do nothing about it. "This is a terrible woman," thought Polly. "She's strong enough to break my arm with one twist. And now that she's got my left hand, I can't get at my yellow ring. If I tried to reach across and get my right hand into my left pocket, I wouldn't be able to reach it before she asked me what I was doing. Whatever happens, we mustn't let her know about the rings. I do hope Diggory has the sense to keep his mouth shut. I wish I could get a word with him alone." The queen led them out of the Hall of Images into a long corridor, and then through a whole maze of halls and stairs and courtyards. Again and again, they heard the sound of the palace crashing, collapsing, sometimes quite close to them. The queen was walking quickly. The children had to trot to keep up with her, but she showed no sign of fear. Diggory thought, "She's wonderfully brave and strong. She's what I call a queen. I do hope she's going to tell us the story of this place." And she did tell them certain things as they went along. "This is the door of the dungeons," she would say, or "that passage leads to the principal torture chambers," or "this was the old banqueting hall where my great-grandfather bade 700 nobles come to a feast and killed them all before they had drunk their fill. They had rebellious thoughts." They came at last into a hall larger and loftier than any they had yet seen. From its size and from the great doors at the far end, Diggory thought that now at last they must be coming to the main entrance, and in this he was quite right. The doors were dead black, either ebony or some black metal which is not found in our world. Let me show you a picture first of the queen with the children. You can see the archways that are collapsing around them. And then here's a picture of the doors. Can you see those okay? Black doors. All right. They were fastened with great bars, most of them too high to reach, and all of them too heavy to lift. He wondered how they would get out. The queen let go of his hand and raised her arm. She drew herself up to her full height and stood rigid. Then she'd said something which they couldn't understand, but it sounded horrid, and made an action as if she was throwing something toward the doors. And those high and heavy doors trembled as if they were made out of silk fabric, and then they crumbled away until there was nothing left of them but a heap of dust on the threshold. "Whew," whistled Diggory. "Has your master magician, your uncle, power like mine?" asked the queen, firmly seizing Diggory's hand again. But I shall know later. In the meantime, remember what you have seen. This is what happens to things and to people who stand in my way." Much more light than they had yet seen in that country was pouring in through the now empty doorway. And when the queen led them out through it, they were not surprised to find themselves in the open air. The wind that blew in their faces was cold and yet somehow stale. They were looking from a high terrace, and there was a great landscape spread out below them. Down low and near the horizon hung a great red sun, far bigger than our own. Diggory felt at once that it was also much older than ours, a sun near the very end of its life, weary at looking down on that world. To the left of the sun, and higher up, was a single star, big and bright, and those were the only two things in the dark sky, and they made a dismal group. And on the earth, in every direction, as far as the eye could see, there spread a vast city in which there was no living thing to be seen. All the temples, towers, palaces, pyramids, and bridges cast long, disastrous-looking shadows in the light of that withered sun. Once a great river had flowed through the city, but the water had long since vanished, and it was now only a wide, gray ditch of dust. "Look well on those which eyes will never see again," said the queen. "Such was Charn, the great city, the city of the King of Kings, the wonder of the world, and perhaps all world. Does your uncle rule any city as great as this, boy?" "No," said Diggory. He was going to explain that Uncle Andrew didn't rule any cities, but the queen went on. "It is silent now, but I have stood here when the whole air was full of the noises of Charn, the trampling of feet, the creaking of wheels, the cracking of whips, the groaning of slaves, the thunder of chariots, the sacrificial drums beating in the temples. I have stood here," but that was near the end, "when the roar of battle went up from every street and the river of Charn ran red." She paused and asked, "All in one moment, one woman blotted it out forever." "Who?" said Diggory in a faint voice, but he'd already guessed the answer. "I," said the queen. "I, Jadis, the last queen, but the queen of the world." In case you didn't get that because I accidentally turned it off, let me repeat that. I, Jadis, the last queen, but the queen of the world. And here, may I just have a little diversion for a second? Her name is spelled Jadis. And I understand that here in the United States, most people pronounce that Jadis. Over in Europe, some people thought that it sounded like a French word, and so they pronounce it Jadi. Other people thought it looked more Scandinavian, and so they call her Yadis. But Douglas Gresham, who was C.S. Lewis's stepfather, C.S. Lewis was married to Douglas Gresham's mother, he asked him how to pronounce it, and C.S. Lewis, whose nickname was Jack, just for your information, Jack told him that it should be pronounced Jadis, and so that's what I'm going with, and I hope you're okay with that too. The two children stood silent, shivering in the cold wind. It was my sister's fault, said the queen. She drove me to it. May the curse of all the powers rest on her forever. At any moment, I was ready to make peace, yes, and to spare her life too, if she would only yield to me the throne. But she would not. Her pride had destroyed the whole world. Even after the war had begun, there was a solemn promise that neither side would use magic. But when she broke her promise, what could I do? Fool, as if she did not know that I had more magic than she. Even she knew that I had the secret of the deplorable word. Did she? She was always a weakling. Did she think I wouldn't use it? What was it? Said Diggory. That was the secret of secrets, said the Queen Jadis. It had long been known to the great kings of our race that there was a word which, if spoken with the proper ceremonies, would destroy all living things except the one who spoke it. But the ancient kings were weak and soft-hearted, and they bound themselves and all who should come after them with great oaths, never even to seek after the knowledge of that word. But I learned it in a secret place and paid a terrible price to learn it. I did not use it until she forced me to do it. I fought to overcome her by every other means. I poured out the blood of my enemies like water. Beast, said Polly. The last great battle, said the Queen, raged for 3 days here in Charn itself. For 3 days I looked down from this very spot. I did not use my power until the last of my soldiers had fallen, and that accursed woman, my sister, was halfway up those great steps that led from the city to this terrace. Then I waited until we were so close that we could see each other's faces. And she said, flashing her horrible wicked eyes upon me, she said, "Victory!" And I said, "Yes, but the victory is not yours." A moment later, I spoke the deplorable word. And a moment later, I was the only living thing beneath the sun. But the people, said Diggory. What people, boy? Asked the Queen. All the ordinary people, said Polly, who've never done you any harm. All the women and the children and the animals. Don't you understand? She was still speaking to Diggory. I was the Queen. They were all my people. What else were they there for except to do my will? It was rather hard luck on them just the same, said he. I have forgotten that you're just a common boy. How could you understand reasons of state? You must learn, child, that what would be wrong for you or for any of the common people is not wrong in a great queen such as I. The weight of the world is on our shoulders. We must be freed from all rules. Ours is a high and lonely destiny. Diggory suddenly remembered that Uncle Andrew had used those exact same words, but they did sound much grander when Queen Jadis said them, perhaps because Uncle Andrew wasn't 7 feet tall and dazzlingly beautiful. And what did you do then? Said Diggory. I had already cast strong spells on the halls where the images of my ancestors sit, And the force of those spells was that I should sleep among them like an image myself, and neither need food nor fire, though I stayed there 1,000 years, until one came and struck the bell and woke me. Was it the deplorable word that made the sun like that? Said Diggory. Like what? Said Jadis. So big, so red, and so cold. It's always been so, said Jadis, at least for hundreds and thousands of years. Have you a different sort of sun in your world? Yes, it's smaller and yellower, and it gives out a good deal more heat. The queen gave out a long, drawn ah, and Diggory saw on her face that same hungry and greedy look that he had lately seen on Uncle Andrew's. So, she said, yours is a younger world. She paused for a moment to look one more at the deserted city, as if she was sorry for all the evil she had done there, but she certainly didn't show it, and then said, Now, let us be going. It is cold here at the end of all the ages. Going where? Said both the children. Where? Said Jadis in surprise. To your world, of course. Polly and Diggory looked at each other aghast. Polly had disliked the queen from the first, and even Diggory, now that he'd heard her story, felt that he had seen quite as much of her as he wanted. Certainly she was not the kind of person you wanted to take home. And if they did, they didn't know how they could. What they wanted was to get themselves away, but Polly couldn't get her at her ring, and of course Diggory couldn't go home without her. Diggory got very red in the face and stammered, "Oh, our world! I didn't know you wanted to go there." Well, what else were you sent here for, if not to fetch me? Said Jadis. I'm sure you wouldn't like our world at all, said Diggory. It's not her sort of place, is it, Dick Polly? It's very dull, not worth seeing, really. It'll be worth seeing when I rule it, answered the queen. Oh, but you can't, said Diggory. It's not like that. They wouldn't let you, you know. The queen gave a contemptuous smile. Many great kings thought they could stand against the House of Charn, but they all fell, and their names are forgotten. Foolish boy, do you think that I, with my beauty and my magic, would not have your whole world at my feet before a year had passed? Prepare your incantations and take me there at once. This is perfectly frightful, said Diggory to Polly. Perhaps you fear for this uncle of yours, said Jadis, but if he honors me duly, he shall keep his life and his throne. I'm not coming to fight against him. He must be a very great magician if he has found out how to send you here. Is he king of your whole world, or only a part of it? He isn't king of anywhere, said Diggory. You're lying, said the queen. Does not magic always go with royal blood? Who ever heard of common people being magicians? I can see the truth whether you speak it or not. Your uncle is a great king and the great enchanter of your world, and by his art he has seen the shadow of my face in some magic mirror or some enchanted pool, and for the love of my beauty he has made a potent spell which shook your world to its foundations and sent you across the vast gulf between world and world to ask my favor and now to bring me to him. Answer me, is that not how it was? Well, not exactly, said Diggory. Not exactly, said Polly. Why, that's absolute bosh from beginning to end. Minions, cried the queen, turning in a rage upon Polly and seizing her hair at the very top of her head where it hurts the most. But in doing so, she let go of both the children's hands. Now, shouted Diggory, and quick, shouted Polly. They plunged their left hands into their pockets. They didn't even need to put the rings on the moment they touched them. The whole of that dreary world vanished from their eyes. They were rushing upward, and a great, warm, green light was growing nearer overhead. And that's the end of chapter 5. See you next time. Bye.